Good morning again. I think most of you know that we have at our house a freshman in college this year. And so that's a new experience for us, being down to a threesome instead of a foursome most days now. And we went to visit our daughter in college for Parents' Weekend last weekend, another new experience for all of us. And as we were walking around the campus and began to meet some of the people that she has been in contact with and envision her life there, it took me back to that same time period in my life. And whether or not you spent those years between 18 and 22 years old in college or not, I think many of us would look back at that time as a formative time in our lives. There's a lot that takes place in those years. For many of us, it's the first time that we are living outside of our parents' home, not living under their roof anymore. That first taste of kind of a degree of independence like we have not experienced before. And, nobody's there anymore to tell her that she's got to turn her phone in because it's curfew time. Or nobody's going to be there to tell her how late she can come back in. And nobody's going to make sure that she's following up on her studies. And in fact, now, you may not even realize this, but you as a parent, even if you pay the bills, are locked out of your child's grades. So you don't get to see that stuff. And it is a different kind of way of being for her and for us. And I remember that time period and thinking that this is the time when I guess I get to make my own decisions around things like what I believe, what my actions are going to be. Some things I can do without consequence, even if my parents don't know about them because they won't find out about them. Those kinds of decisions. Will I make worship a part of my life? What classes will I take? What am I filling my head with? Who am I associating myself with? All of those kinds of decisions, right? And so it's a big identity-shaping kind of phase of life. And that's what I want to talk about a little bit today as we continue in this sermon series, a very short sermon series around baptism that started last Sunday and will end next Sunday as we have the opportunity to think about our own baptisms in a special way and celebrate with those who have been going through this baptismal reclamation program that we started last Sunday here at the church. And we've been doing this within the framework of talking about the story of the Israelites. And so last week we began by talking about how the Hebrew people ended up in Egypt, and then the story a little bit about Joseph and his brothers, and then they became, after several generations where their associations and their history with Joseph is no more, there's now this time of slavery, and so for generations the Israelites are suffering under the harsh leadership of the Pharaoh and their slaves, and then Moses is born, enters into the story. God tells Moses to lead the people out, and so they pass through the Red Sea to the other shore, and we talked about how even in the ancient church, there was a comparison and an understanding that passage from leaving Egypt and going into a new land of the wilderness, that passage through the waters was symbolic of baptism. How when we pass through the waters of baptism, so to speak, we are not the same anymore. We are leaving something behind in favor of something that is yet unknown, yet trusting God's guidance to lead us into that new place. Now, as you heard, the story continued today. Stephen read a passage of Scripture which, where it started and where it ended is probably not where most of the time this passage is read. It basically says, do you remember? It says that Moses had guided the Israelites into the wilderness, and immediately they began to grumble because they were not being fed well, and they said, we're hungry, and they said, we might as well have just stayed in Egypt where at least we could have a square meal if we knew that this is how we were going to die. Thanks a lot, Moses. The word of God for the people of God. Like that's where we left. the scripture. And so I purposely chose it that way so that there would be a bit of a cliffhanger for you, but to also emphasize the main part of the story, which is that this is where the rubber meets the road in terms of beginning to create an identity. I remember years ago I was talking to a colleague, and this particular passage, or this part of the story at least, came up. And I just remember saying, I can't believe that the Israelites have such a short memory that they are already acting so ungrateful. Have they not seen what has just taken place in the story? I mean, remember now, they are being whipped and beaten and stripped of their rights, and they are an enslaved population. And they get freed after a series of plagues is visited upon their evil Pharaoh. And then finally the seas are parted. They're able to go through. Their enemies are drowned behind them. They are now home free in the wilderness, in this new place, free for their destiny that awaits. And the first thing they do is say, we're hungry. Can you believe the ingratitude? And this colleague pointed out to me something that has stuck with me ever since. He said, do you think just because they crossed the waters means that they are out of the mentality and their understanding as slaves? For generations, this is all they had known, and then they're removed from that, and they're supposed to be whole new beings? Absolutely not. One doesn't change because they crossed through the Red Sea. It's more involved than that. And so he said that there would probably need to be a much longer period of time before they would understand what it means to be a new creation or a different kind of identity in their own eyes as God sees them for what they are becoming. And I think he was absolutely right about that. Just because you graduate high school and start college doesn't mean that, boom, you are a new person. As many of us may have wanted to create a new identity for ourselves as a clean slate, great, good, all that, and yet we can't help but bring what we have been all along into this new scenario, into this new setting, and into this new time period. It's interesting that ends up what happens is that there's 40 years of time in the wilderness. 40. Apparently, that is the amount of time that is necessary for this group of people to leave their former identity behind and embrace their new hope-filled future. 40 years. They're impatient after about 72 hours, which sounds right, doesn't it? But it's going to take 40 years. And if you remember what happens in this story, this is when they learn how to be community. This is where they receive the law. This is where they learn worship practices. This is when God cares for their physical needs by providing clean water and manna for them to eat, and the manna is enough. Or if you need to take more than your share, it can only be enough to make sure that somebody in your household who can't gather the manna for themselves has enough for their daily bread. It's the give us this day our daily bread part of our prayer. And so they begin to learn about what does worshiping God look like? What is pleasing to God? How do I conduct myself? What does it mean to live peaceably with my neighbors? How do I make sure that they have enough and that my needs are cared for? How can we, all of that, right? It's that understanding. It is the creation of a culture. It is the creation of the rules that govern the people. It is a way of understanding who it is that they worship. And it is now a time of formulating their own identity. But it's going to take 40 years. We see this 40 appearing so many other times in the Bible, right? Seems like whenever there is a major shift taking place, the number 40 is involved. The 40 days and nights on the ark, in one telling of the flood story. Jesus is tempted after his baptism for 40 days in the wilderness. Again, another 40 in the wilderness kind of moment. We have a series of 40 days during our season of Lent. The spies, Joshua and the other spies, they go into the promised land for 40 days to sort of suss out the situation, right? These 40 numbers keep appearing because God in God's wisdom understands that we don't go from A to B without something in between. There needs to be some sort of transition time. There needs to be something that happens. And so, for the purposes of thinking about our baptism, we can be baptized. We can know what we are taking on when we want to receive baptism, if we are old enough to understand the difference. But that doesn't mean that a transformation in our lives necessarily happens just like that and everything clicks at once. And for those of us, myself included, who are baptized as infants, as probably is the case with many of you, what we appreciate in that is that we may be baptized into this new identity, but it is going to take a long time for that identity to formulate. In fact, I would argue that most of us spend our lives in this 40-year identity-seeking, formulating part of our existence, where we know where we have come from, we don't yet know where we are going, and we spend a lot of time thinking about what does it mean to have the identity as a Christian. And we learn, and we make mistakes, and we go forward, and then we take a step backward, and this is about what living life is all about. To put it in terms around grace, like Wesley talked about, we have the prevenient grace, which is the part that urges us forward to perhaps desire baptism, the desire to move through the water. Then we end up in this justifying grace period where we spend much of our lives, but we want to work towards sanctifying grace, but we're not yet there. That's the entering into the promised land part of the story. So most of us find ourselves in this wilderness wandering stage, and we're going to spend a lot of our lives here. We may get a taste of what it looks like. We may get to glance into the promised land and see that, but a lot of our lives are going to be spent here, and we're working on that. So if I were to ask you, what is your identity? You'd probably be inclined to think about some of the things that maybe you thought about earlier in an identity-forming part of your life. In our early teen years or our preteen years, we're trying to figure out, who are my people? Where do I fit in? Am I cool or not? What category do I fit in, right? And then thankfully, we ditch that later on in early adulthood, hopefully, maybe. And then we move into this part where we're asking those harder questions. What do I believe in? What are my ethics? What rules govern my life? What higher thing do I aspire to? If I'm now the one ultimately responsible and accountable for my own actions, what are my choices going to be? And as Christians, even if we're prepared to make that commitment, we still spend a lot of time, like the Israelites do in the wilderness, trying to figure it out. In fact, sometimes it feels like the more spiritually mature and astute that we become or feel, the more it is that we are firmly convinced that we are back in the wilderness stage, right? We have lots of questions. We want to move forward, and yet sometimes we struggle to do so. But that's the beauty of coming together as a community, because we are able to challenge one another, to support one another. We participate in classes and small groups and do readings. We ask one another things about checking in with each other's lives, right? You spend so much of what we do as a Christian community is engaging with one another so that we can help one another navigate this path through the wilderness. This is a part of what we do. And it's an important step that cannot be skipped over. There is no shortcut through the wilderness. I recently learned of a woman who was born in 1937 in Yazoo City, Mississippi. She's an African-American woman born Bertha Bowman. Now, Bertha, growing up in the segregated South and the Mississippi Delta, found that by the time she was 9 years old, she had a deep connection to the gospel. She felt like the messages that she heard about God and about Christ's love in her life compelled her to join the church. And not much perhaps is known, or at least I don't know much about her early childhood, but she felt compelled and led, perhaps because this was her moving through the Red Sea kind of moment. But she was baptized as a Roman Catholic and took the vows of membership in the church and became a practicing Catholic at 9 years old, which is pretty impressive for a 9-year-old without her parents sort of pushing her along in the process. By age 15, she committed herself to a convent where she became a nun in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and served for many years as one of the sisters there. It was there that she took on another name of Thea, Saint Thea, being a martyr from Gaza who challenged the Roman emperor about her Christian beliefs, and she was killed and martyred for her beliefs. But she took on that name, Thea, and Thea Bowman became somebody who became a new voice within Catholicism in America. Because she was one, as a black woman, who talked about what it means to be black and Catholic, which there weren't many people doing at that time. And she would talk about her identity and say, I am a woman, I am a black woman, I am Catholic, and all of these things are part of my identity. This is who God created me to be. And she was a much sought-after speaker and helped change a lot of hearts and minds as she worked for equality and integration and justice in the church. The thing about Thea that made me understand more about her and how I found her is that she is the one who coined a turn of phrase that many of us have said many, many times over, that I think it helps us understand our identity. She's the one who reportedly was the first to say, I know who I am, I know whose I am. How many of us have said that before? Something to that effect, right? I know who I am, I know whose I am, right? It's the idea that as a Christian person, we are able to say that this is who I am because I know whose I am. And it's the place that I think many of us must begin when we start thinking about our own identity. What is our identity as a person? What is our identity as a follower of Jesus Christ? What does it mean to be one who is part of this experience of moving through the wilderness of our faith? To begin with knowing whose we are, which lays the groundwork for who we are. I'm a lot of things, and I could name a lot of things that I would include as part of my identity, but the one that it all begins with is whose I am. Because when we begin by saying, I am a precious and beloved child of God, it sets the groundwork for everything else that follows. Many of you have talked about your own identity. I'm a mother. I'm an educator. I'm a social worker. I'm a CPA. I'm a brother. Yes, but you are a follower of Christ. You are a beloved child of God. And all of these other things flow from that one true understanding of whose we are before we understand who we are. As we think about this time in the wilderness, I invite you to ponder what it is that is part of your identity. As you think about what guides you, what leads you in your decision making, where do your values come from? What ethics do you live by? What is the thing that motivates you or inspires you for the decisions that you make, or the actions that you do or do not take, or how you interact with others, or how you act respectfully in your community, and how you serve your neighbor? All of these things are based in the idea of knowing whose we are so that we can have a better grasp on who we are. Next week, as you come forward to offer and share in these waters of baptism and celebrate the baptismal remembrance and reclamation with those who are in this church who have been a part of this process, we will also engage in this idea of identity. We will talk about naming. We will talk about values. We will talk about the things that we are committing to in the covenant that we are making once again with God. And it's a reminder whose we are that leads us to a deeper understanding of who it is that each one of us is, who we are meant to be, and where we are headed. Will you pray with me?